We're here with Amy Howe, one of the co-founding editors of SCOTUSblog, one of the key Supreme Court coverage sites that aims its product at the general public, lawyers, and journalists. And she is a former editor and a current blogger for them. You described the Supreme Court beat as one of the worst beats as well as one of the best of the beats. Can you explain on that for me?
Sure. In some ways, it's a great beat to come to, even if you can cover the court very effectively, even if you don't have a lot of experience covering it, because all of the briefs are available online. All of the journalists can go to the oral arguments, and the justices really make their decisions based on the briefs and the oral arguments, as they'll tell you. And so it's not something where you necessarily need to be able to work your connections over the phone to cover the court effectively. The worst of beats, the downside is that in many ways the court is not particularly transparent. The transcripts are available the same day, but the oral argument audio isn't available until the end of the week. And there are many things about the way that the court operates where you just don't necessarily know what's going on.
Okay, now you also said it's not an entrepreneurial beat. What do you mean by that? And then if it's not, how does a reporter stand out?
That's a hard question. How do you stand out? It's a sort of common complaint among people who cover the Supreme Court. It's not an entrepreneurial beat in the sense that the Supreme Court has the cases, they decide what they're going to hear, and again, it's not a question of sort of working the phones and trying to get someone at the Supreme Court to tell you what's going on. That you have sort of a finite list of cases in which the Supreme Court hears oral arguments, and we're all dealing with, we're all reading the same briefs, listening to the same oral arguments, parsing the same opinions. Sometimes it's hard to come up with a different take on it, a different explanation, because you've only got so much to work with.
Okay. Now let me ask a fairly practical question. Things like transcripts from court sessions, are those available? How long does it take to get them? And has it always been that way?
There's unofficial transcripts are available for the press within an hour and a half after the oral arguments end. And if you're down at the Supreme Court, you can ask to be put on the list of journalists who will receive the unofficial transcripts. And then later on that day, the official transcripts go up on the court's website, and anyone can read them. And this is an improvement over the old days when the transcripts weren't released until later, and they simply identified the justices asking the questions as justice or the court. They didn't identify the justice who asked a question by name. And so if you were at the Supreme Court either covering it or as an advocate, you really had to make an effort to figure out who asked which question, because it wouldn't be on the transcript later.
Now, another practical question. If you don't cover the court regularly, but go and cover arguments, you could be sitting behind a pillar in which you can't even see which justices are talking. What's your practical tip for how people can kind of learn the justices' voices?
The best way to do it is to go to a website called OYES, which has a whole wealth of information about the Supreme Court, but in particular collects all of the oral argument audio for cases going back decades, and they have the oral argument audio synced with the transcripts, and pictures of the justices as they speak are highlighted. And so you can go and listen to those old oral arguments and get a sense for what the justices sound like, so that even if you can't see Justice Kennedy or Justice Kagan when she's speaking, you recognize the voice.
Which two justices are the toughest to discern?
It's not that difficult these days. There were days when it was harder to identify, particularly, but they all, at least to me, maybe because I've been covering the court and following the court for so long, they seem to have very distinct voices. Okay.
And finally, just like some idea of the scope of the court's caseload. In a typical year, how many cases are petitioned to the court? How many do they actually take and argue and put decisions out on? And how many of those are actually kind of newsworthy to the broad general public?
Sure. The Supreme Court gets thousands of requests every year to review a case on the merits. They grant a very small fraction of those, somewhere between 65 and 75, depending on the year. Now, to be sure, a large fraction of the petitions for review that are filed are actually what they call pro se, informa pauperis, petitions filed often by prisoners seeking review of some aspect of their cases. And so there are many cases that come to the Supreme Court that have, essentially a zero chance of being granted. But of the cases that do have a legitimate shot at being granted, they take usually somewhere between 65 and 75. And then there's a sort of another sort of parallel docket of cases called emergency appeals, in which it could be a death penalty case in the months leading up to an election, as we've got going on right now. There may be voting rights cases asking the Supreme Court to step in, and various controversies over voting rights that may or may not ever actually reach the court on the merits, but by allowing an election to go forward using a particular rule still may have, or not using a particular rule, still could have a big effect on the country.
Okay. I think that's all I need. Thank you very much.
Thank you.